My guest today is Mark Schwartz, an enterprise strategist at Amazon Web Services. Mark, great to see you again. It's been a while since you had left government, but it's good to see you starting to pop back in. Welcome to the discussion.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Let me set just a little bit of context for our discussion today. Congress and the Biden administration put their money where their mouths are by allocating $150 million for the Federal Citizen Services Fund. The General Services Administration, which runs the fund, allocated money for 14 citizen-facing digital service projects just recently. These range from assisting families eligible for the child tax credit to streamlining identity verification to bridging the gap in Wi-Fi access. These projects are just some of the ways agencies have shifted their efforts over the last few years to focus more on citizen services. Well, the concept of being more citizen-centric may have started back, what do you say, Mark, about 2002, 3 clicks to service, the old e-government projects. You remember those days, I'm sure. This idea, this concept really has reached new heights between the pandemic, the acceptance of cloud and the use of DevSecOps approach to development, and really the maturation of the user experience, user design principles. To continue to make improvements, agencies need the right technology and the appropriate training to ensure citizens continue to have a positive experience with government. In fact, a recent survey by Eagle Hill Consulting in July found agencies could take specific steps to improve customer experience, including tying employee metrics to customer experience metrics, showing employees how the work they do really impacts their customers, and involving the employees in their decisions to improve customer experience. And of course, as I mentioned, the technology that underlies all these efforts must be available, agile, and secure. So Mark, let's just start there. Customer experience, we talk a lot about it. We know it's important. There's an executive order coming, but why? Why is it so important today than ever before, beyond, I'm going to say, the pandemic, which we've talked ad nauseum about?
I'll talk a little bit more ad nauseum, I guess. This might seem obvious, but during the pandemic, of course, organizations had to interact with the public through digital services primarily. I'm thinking of I had to renew my driver's license, for example, during the pandemic. I live in Massachusetts now. And of course, the Motor Vehicle Bureau was all online. I had to do it that way. So a lot of organizations found that they suddenly had to do all their interactions digitally. I think there's another important thing to think about in relation to the pandemic, which is that it was a major disruption, and we're going to have major disruptions in the future. And they might not be pandemics. They could be just about anything. And what that says to me is that organizations have to be agile enough, nimble enough, and fast enough to be able to respond to it, whatever it is, right? We don't know what's coming. So that requires a lot of flexibility. And if that's true for the private sector, so much more so for the government, because it's really, when the disaster happens, whatever it is, it's the government that has to stimulate private enterprise, has to support the public, has to support businesses and all of that. So the government has to be prepared to respond quickly and nimbly as well.
One of the things we've seen with the pandemic is this idea that they were able to, that urgency really forced their hand, really take chances and do things that maybe they would not have done normally. Outside of the pandemic, right? Once things have kind of come back to semi-normal, whatever the new normal is going to be, they still need to have that agility, that ability to move. Is that realization is what you're seeing, whether in the public sector or the private sector?
Oh yeah. The pace of change seems to be pretty fast these days, for whatever reason, pandemics or something else. Changing consumer expectations, changing geopolitical situations, changing regulation. As these things change fast, organizations have to be able to respond to those changes quickly enough to seize opportunities, quickly enough to avoid pitfalls and things like that. So it's a general trend across the whole economy, I think.
That pace of change, and part of it's driven by the technology that underlies all of these services. And I know you can talk probably a lot about AWS, but maybe give me an understanding of how the technology is forcing that pace of change.
Well, with the cloud, for example, you mentioned you didn't actually mention
cloud on the front end with DevSecOps.
When we talked before, you mentioned, yes, DevSecOps.
And cloud and all those good things.
Yeah, all those good things. The cloud, for example, makes it possible to acquire infrastructure very quickly, but not just infrastructure. These days, more and more of what we're doing in the cloud is higher level services, as we call them, things like machine learning, edge computing, advanced analytics, virtual reality, augmented reality, all of those things are available sort of as building blocks that can be acquired pretty much immediately by any organization. I think there's also the fact that the public's expectations, of course, are rising because they interact with some of the very digital organizations like my own, Amazon.com, which aims to be the most customer-centric organization on the planet and has been working at it for a while and is raising the bar, I think, in general for everybody.
I think the public expectations, we've been hearing that for quite a while. And again, you and I can go back to Mark Foreman in his days of e-government projects and citizen-centric 3 clicks to service. But do you think that something has changed, that the reason why we're more focused on that citizen expectation now more than ever? Because, it's been 20 years, right? We can go back that long to say, well, this has been important for 2 decades.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you have something in mind. What I'm thinking, though, is it's related to success with initiatives, really, and mission. If we can be faster and more nimble and use contemporary technologies and architectures, I think government organizations can do a much better job of conducting programs and projects successfully, of making good use of taxpayer money and other public resources.
I highlighted the GSA efforts about the 14 projects through the Federal Citizen Services Fund. There's a ton going on across government. Are there any that stand out to you? Anything? Your driver's license example is a great one. Hopefully that was a good example. But are there some others that you'd point to that says, hey, this is working well, or this is down a path that I could see in 6 months, a year, whatever it is, they're really going to move from 80% happy to 99% happy, or whatever the numbers are?
Well, I see things going on all over the government. But sometimes I can see where the mechanics are working in a very positive way. So to give you a few examples, my old agency, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, it had a down year for revenues, right? It had less demand for its services, and it was able to adjust its spending in the cloud correspondingly. One of the wonderful things about the cloud is that you can scale down or scale up freely as you need to. On the other hand, back whenever that last real government shutdown was, which, as usual, it sort of takes part of the agency, part of USCIS, into a sudden new world, I think. E-Verify, in particular, which is vulnerable to those shutdowns. After being off for a month, it had a big backlog of transactions, and by being able to scale up in the cloud, was able to process all of that whole backlog of transactions really quickly. So that shows you that the idea is working, the mechanics are working. We've now seen the census conducted online, doing online surveys. I've been told that HUD has an application they call Stella that helps them analyze data about homelessness, which is another big part of, I think, what's going on, this ability that we now have to dive deeply into data and manipulate it with machine learning and things like that. So clearly it's all happening. I also work with other governments, and some tremendous activity in Canada, for example, where the Canadian Border Agency created its Arrive Can application to track quarantine and contacts. There was COVID alert that the government of Canada prepared and launched very quickly. The British Columbia government, for example, does vaccine management on this. So, all of these things that had to happen quickly and were able to happen quickly because of the new tools we have available.
I love your examples at both. I remember the E-Verify backlog, and I think they actually won an award from one of the government organizations like ACT-IAC or somebody for that E-Verify to be able to scale up and scale down. Is that the biggest challenge for agencies right now, because they're still dealing with this legacy infrastructure, because they're still dealing with older systems that if they're not in the cloud, if they don't have that flexibility, that serving the customer in a new way becomes that much more difficult?
Yeah, and it's not just government. I work a lot with private sector customers as well. Large enterprises in general are held back by their legacy technologies, their legacy systems, which just weren't really created to be able to be changed very quickly and very nimbly, right? We didn't build technology for that 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So in the course of modernizing now, which a lot of organizations are doing, they're able to set up processes that keep them nimble. They're able to set up architectures and use tools that can keep them nimble and set them up for speed in the future.
And really, I mean, as you said, the pace of change that's where we're going to. And I know we're going to hit up at a break in a second, so when we come back, we'll talk about how to kind of take advantage of that IT modernization. Is the other challenge that you're seeing maybe across whether public or private sector, the technology is a piece of it, but it's also the people themselves kind of changing here we go, I know you're ready for it, the culture change of it?
Yeah. I have a little experience with culture change, yeah. Of course. I found with large organizations, this is typical of large organizations, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector, is that they've set themselves up to be really good at doing whatever it is they did yesterday, right? That's in the nature of it, especially successful ones, right? If they become good at doing something, then they've set themselves up to do that really well. And now that they're trying to change, that gets in the way. And they all have to find some way to change the culture to get people more used to working in the new way they want them to.
All right, we're going to figure out how they do that in the next segment, but first let's take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion IT Modernization for Citizen Services, sponsored by Amazon Web Services on Federal News Network.